Afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the customer appreciation event here this afternoon. I'm Brian Martinezson. I'm the commercial leader for the Manitoba region. Will be your host for this afternoon's 90-minute session. Uh, not to make sure everybody understands the Manitoba region, what it covers. It covers our grain elevators and crop input facilities in Manitoba, and as well as our facility in Yorkton, Saskatchewan. So welcome to our Saskatchewan customers that have tuned in for today. Uh, we Before I look at the agenda, I just want to say we do truly appreciate the business that you all do with us, and one of the ways that we can show our appreciation is for having events like this. We know that clearly there's lots going on in the space of the fertilizer markets, weather, and grain prices, and so we've lined up our agenda this afternoon to try to talk through some of those things. So we've got four things we need to cover in the agenda today. We always start off with safety context and values, so we want to do that. We're going to have Matthew Rajdan, who is our fertilizer merchandising manager, going to talk about the fertilizer markets. We're going to have Drew Lerner, who some of you may have heard last year on a session just like this. He's the founder, president, and senior agriculture meteorologist for World Weather Inc. So we're happy to have Drew back with us here today. Then Ben Kuznia is going to be joining the session as the senior product manager of Grain Origination Solutions to talk to grain marketing alternatives and solutions that we may have as a result of the fertilizer and weather discussions. So looking forward to the next 90 minutes. We will have the online chat open for questions. We'll be monitoring that as the session goes. We will try to bring forward, if time permits, questions to the various presenters. And if we can't get to all the questions that are in the chat, we'll certainly make sure that we have somebody follow up with the people that sent the questions to make sure you get your answers for your questions. With that, kicking off with a safety contact, you'll see that we've brought up a reminder around rail and rail crossings. And why we brought this to this group is we just had an incident recently in one of our facilities in Gramercy, Louisiana, where part of our daily practice is to drive a forklift across a rail crossing to get to one side of our facility and the other. And that's been going on for many, many years. On this particular day, the the employee that was driving the forklift, uh, we have a standard process that the forks have to be a certain so many inches or so many feet off the ground when you're traveling. The forks were too low, and as they went across the railroad crossing, the forks dug into the railroad crossing, and the forklift got hung up right on the main line of a CN rail line in Louisiana. The employee had a two-way radio, radio back into the plant. They and said he's hung up. He's coming back to the plant. They walk back to the plant to figure out what to do. Long story short, train came through and demolished our forklift. Thankfully, nobody was present. Obviously, property damage is you know, is something we can deal with. We certainly don't want to get anybody hurt, but we lost a forklift that day, but we certainly didn't have any personal injuries. But it made me think of across Manitoba and across the prairies. There's many rail crossings that are there, and what this and where the safety contact comes to. If you can go to the next slide, is I'm not what this employee failed to recognize on that particular day is that on every rail crossing in Western Canada or in North America, there is a phone number on the crossbucks, which are the signals you see at the top or the lights, um, and on the the picture on the right hand side, there's a little feature where that number is, but there is a phone number there and identification of where you're at. So if we would have done that, the employee would have radioed back, call this number at this particular crossing and siding. We would have been able to put a halt to that train. So it's a good reminder to all of us, everyone on the call today. Many people may know this already, but if you don't, if you're crossing a railroad crossing and you stall your truck or piece of equipment and you can't get it started again, the phone number's on the crossbuck sign or the signal sign. If the lights aren't working or the arms aren't working, you can also use that same number to inform the railway that the crossing is malfunctioning, or there's any obstructions that are blocking it. All those sorts of things. But it's just a great reminder to us all that at one point in our life, we may come across a situation and that something's hung up, or something's blocking the tracks, or something's not working at a railroad crossing. Call that number. The person, it's monitored 24/7. There will be somebody there to answer, and they can determine whether to stop a train or send out a crew to fix the particular issue on the crossing. So, thought it was very timely given the incident we had, and we were fortunate that it didn't involve any personal injury, but thought it would be relatable to the broader group today. So that's a safety contact we'd like to share. With that, we'll we've got 90 minutes, so I want to keep everybody moving along. I'll try to do my best. That's not always possible when we get into some very passionate discussions, topics of discussion like we have this afternoon, being fertilizer pricing and markets and weather and grain. But with that, I would like to introduce Matthew Rajjan. I said earlier, he's our merchandising leader our merchandising manager for our fertilizer business, and Matthew's going to share with us what's going on in fertilizer markets, and we'll go from there. Thanks, Matthew. Over to you.
Thanks, Brian. Great safety contact. That's something I learned the phone number on the crossing. I did not know that. Thanks for having me. I'm very happy to be here. We're going to go. I got a few slides to go through, but just kind of give you an update on where we're at, why we're here, where we could potentially be going. Then we're going to focus in on nitrogen markets today in the 10 minutes that we have together. So first off, just a chart on New Orleans and what we've seen so far this year. So New Orleans is important to us in Western Canada because prices in North America are essentially set based on the New Orleans market, and as it's the main import port for fertilizer into North America, and North America as a whole is a net importer of nitrogen fertilizer. So we need to compete with the rest of the world for tons to ensure that we have enough nitrogen in North America to meet the demand. And as you can see from the chart, we've had a fairly significant increase. Starting from not this past summer 21, but from the summer of 2020, it's been a fairly it's pretty much gone in one direction with the odd hiccup here or there. Most recently in this past week, we actually saw the first significant decrease in NOLA urea, and I know I've seen some chatter on social media and whatnot in regards to that, and I did want to speak to it. So essentially, what our opinion is we haven't seen the same decline in urea values in other areas of the world. The rest of the world, prices continue to be firm. But there hasn't been a whole lot of trading activity. The reason for that, a few weeks ago, India purchased a large amount of urea. They purchased 4 or 5 months. India's been trying to catch up on purchasing, and every time they've gone to the market to purchase, they've come up short, which then caused prices to continue to move up. But given they were able to acquire 1.6 million tons, that allowed the whole market to take a breath, and it's been fairly quiet since that purchasing tender ended. Last week, there were some traders that needed to unwind some positions in a very illiquid market. So just no one on the other side of any trade that they wanted to take place. And with nobody out there, it just pushed the price down. We don't anticipate this to be a trend in that nitrogen markets are going to continue to fall. If anything, this actually caused the spread of New Orleans and the rest of the world to widen. It was already in around about $100 a ton, and what I mean by that is if you're a producer of fertilizer somewhere else in the world, you can get at least $100 a ton more sending it anywhere but North America. And at some point, North America is going to need to attract 2 million tons of imports to satisfy our needs for this coming year. And in order to do that, either the New Orleans price has to increase to compete and attract the tons, or the rest of the world has to come down to the level that New Orleans is. And we're of the opinion it's probably that New Orleans will have to come up. So we have a momentary, everybody's taking a pause as far as the price increases because we were on a fairly significant, steady pace up. We've just paused momentarily until we see some demand come, which could come at any time. It is rumored that India will be back into the market for another 1.5 million tons sometime, potentially even this week, with an announcement of a purchasing tender. Um, just to kind of give you an idea, there's throughout the entire run up in fertilizer prices, there's been a lot of comparison to 2008. So this chart on the screen it encompasses right back to 2007. And you can see the darker green line on top is the Western Canadian price. And where we're at today is significantly above that level set back in 2008. The New Orleans number, which is the off green color line below, is lower, and it's just, well, actually, with the slight drop last week, it's just below the 2008 level. We matched it, but now we're slightly below. And the only reason why that spread between Western Canada and New Orleans is so high this year versus that year is that year we had a Canadian dollar that was par to the US dollar, and this year we're dealing with a 78 to 82 cent dollar, which has caused that spread to be as wide as it is here versus 2008. Uh, just wanted to talk briefly about, because we got urea, UAN, and ammonia, and I know that there's a pretty decent ammonia uh, business in Manitoba, not one that we necessarily participate in, but for the most part, the three types of nitrogen, urea and UAN, have moved together. Price per pound, they've been in step with each other, but ammonia has not. And we saw that really play out this fall, where the spread got so wide that even with the dry conditions that we had, there was a lot of demand that showed up last minute for ammonia, to the point where we sold out of ammonia in Western Canada. Um, for a couple reasons. One, suppliers, producers of ammonia fertilizer, looked at the conditions in Western Canada and said, okay, well, there's not going to be a big ammonia run this year. They started exporting tons into the US because it was needed there, and it was a premium market to the Western Canadian market, so they started sending it south. And then the spread, which you can see, the lighter green is the price per pound of ammonia, got so wide to urea and UAN that people just started applying it because it was such a discount. And then we very quickly were sold out. We are probably on the verge of seeing prepay offers shortly in the next week or two. And we do anticipate that price per pound spread to UAN and urea is going to get back to a normal historical level, which is about 8 to 10 cents a pound. And when we've actually already kind of seen that start to take place in the US, we've seen reports of the first prepay offers south. And they're coming in at just under $1,600 US per short ton. You do the conversion into a Canadian per metric ton with today's FX, and it works out to about $2,200, which is in line with where we're seeing urea and UAN today. It would be in that range, price per pound, as a normal spread. So just kind of a heads up that's what we're anticipating going to come. We haven't seen any firm offers yet, but that's likely where I think ammonia is likely going. So just more specifically about Western Canada and our current supply, we I do believe we will have enough supply as long as we can just move it and continue to move it through the winter months. The chart on the screen right now is the imports and exports out of Western Canada of urea for the first 3 months of the FERT year. So that's July, September, or July, August, September. And as you can see, the exports that we saw, the darker green line, are the highest that we've seen since 2016. The reason for that is I had mentioned it previous, but the nitrogen, the urea, and other products, the market in the south, so that in the US, was a premium to Western Canada. So suppliers, producers of urea fertilizer in Western Canada could export it into the US and get a better net back than selling it in Western Canada. Not that they didn't sell it to us in Western Canada, just any excess they shipped south. So we saw an increase of exports out of Canada, and then conversely, we saw a decrease in imports because why would anybody send any urea up here if we're a discount to the US? It all stayed down there where they could get more money for the tons that they were selling. So that's net put us about 110,000 tons of less urea in Western Canada for the first 3 months. On top of that, Nutrien's Redwater facility, which is the second largest nitrogen producing facility in Western Canada, just outside Edmonton, went down for a maintenance turnaround. And these things get scheduled where they take the plant down, do a bunch of maintenance just to ensure they don't have any unexpected hiccups. But it was about an 80-day turnaround that took place, which probably cost about 200,000 tons worth of production. So now we're 300,000 tons short in the first 3 months of the FERT year, which it's just not there. So supply in Western Canada is very tight. We're on allocation with most of our suppliers. So any of the tons that we've purchased or that you've purchased, we're waiting to get those loads out of our suppliers, so out of the warehouses that we purchase them from. And we're only allocated so many loads per day because for the most part, everything that's produced is getting shipped in that day. And we need suppliers to continue to produce and get caught up. And the only way they do that is if we continue to ship through the winter months here, which like I said, we can catch up on shipping, but we're going to have a real strong December, January, February, March in order to do that so that there's not any major logistical issues come springtime. So if you have fertilizer booked, please be sure to take it home as soon as you can. Last, just some high level things as to why are we in such tight supply. China, a few months ago, decided to ban exports of fertilizer. They're the largest exporting nation in the world. So a significant impact on supply of not just nitrogen, but phosphate, sulfur, everything. So they've limited exports. They flat out banned them. High energy costs of natural gas in Europe has actually caused a number of fertilizer producing facilities to shut down. Just the cost of producing fertilizer got too high, and that's not going away anytime soon. And that's just now Europe's gone out into the global market looking for additional tons to meet their needs. So again, extra demand in an already limited supply. Russia and Egypt have both implemented export quotas, again, to protect domestic supply for their farmers. They want to ensure that they have the fertilizer to produce the food that they need. Egypt actually just increased their export quota another 10% up to 65%. So 65% of all the tons produced in Egypt will stay in Egypt. And Egypt's a major nitrogen producing region in the world. So it is significant. Like I said, India is rumored to be announcing a new purchasing tender as early as this week, which I think will be, bullish news that kicks off some higher pricing again when we look at New Orleans. And the U.S. needs to buy, like I mentioned, 2 million tons of product ahead of the spring. But we have some time. I think that purchasing probably starts in January, and that's when maybe we see an increase in pricing as well. At the end of the day, we don't anticipate any price relief of fertilizer on fertilizer products ahead of the spring. it will likely firm slightly. I don't think it's going to go for another run like we've seen so far, but I think we will see prices continue to firm as we get closer to the spring. And at some point, likely late 22, so the second half, like past this, maybe into the summer and into the fall, is when we'll start to see some price relief, and maybe get into a little bit more of a normal type market where low in the summer, high in the spring, low in the summer, high in the spring. So, and that is all I have.
I guess I will just run with this at this point. This is Drew Lerner. Um, and it looks like everyone is already pretty much ahead of me as far as asking questions about whether or not we've got a drought ahead of us again in 2022. Well, I do have good news for a big part of the prairies, and I'll explain that. Before I do that, though, there was a question already about uh, what exactly, how to get a hold of us, and I think there may be a little bit of a problem here with getting my slides loaded up. So maybe somebody can help with that here. There we go. All right. Um, one of the questions that was asked already a little bit earlier was how to get a hold of World Weather Incorporated. So hopefully you can get the information off of this chart, off this slide. It's basically you can contact us at www.worldweather.cc, and you can see the email address and telephone number there. This slide will appear at the very end as well. So you will be able to get that information again at the end of this presentation. So let's get into it. I know that there's a lot of question about where we're going from here, and very good questions and a lot of fear, a lot of concern, and a lot of mixed forecasts out there from a lot of folks. So what I'm going to do over these next few minutes is I'm going to make sure that everyone's on the same page with me. I want you to understand what I'm looking at, because here it is, December the 6th, and we are a long way from putting seeds in the ground, and a lot can change between now and then. So as I talk here, I'm going to give you a lot of different information about what's controlling our weather, so that you will be able to make your own decision as to whether or not the forecast that I'm going to give you is going to verify or not. And you'll be able to see how it might have to be adjusted a little bit later down the road. If you were with us last year when we did a similar presentation like this, I think I presented a map very much like what you're seeing in front of you. This is the drought monitor for the North American continent, and this was at the end of October. Unfortunately, NOAA's a little slow in releasing their new maps, but there will be one. If it may be out already today, I don't know, but it hasn't changed any. So what you're looking at is the drought and how broad-based it is across the continent. Very important to keep in mind how broad-based this drought is. The reason why I say that's important is because in order for us to break down the drought, storm systems that are coming into the prairies have to come into the area through a large part of the drought first. So if a storm system comes into the area from the southwest, coming across the U.S. Pacific Northwest and northern Rocky Mountain region, it's going to have to go through a lot of dry air, and it's going to have a really hard time getting moisture all the way over into the eastern part of the prairies. If it's a storm system that's coming up from the Gulf of Mexico, same thing to a certain degree, a little bit easier movement of the moisture into the area, but we still are faced with the same problem with the dry air around. So that's important to keep in mind. Now, this drought, as broad-based as it is a repeating drought. And this is something that we've seen before, and as recently as in the 2000s, 2001 through 2003. And I know that there's a lot of folks, especially out across Saskatchewan, that are fully aware of that. But the parallel is amazing. And it's very unusual to see a drought repeat itself with the same degree of consistency and similarities in general. The top two charts here are from this past year, December last year, in the upper left-hand corner. October of this year is in the upper right-hand corner. And what I want you to note here is how the drought changed over that period of 10 months. And it didn't change much. It actually got worse in Canada. It got a little bit better in part of the U.S. Central Plains. But for the most part, the drought remains very much intact and hasn't changed much. The bottom two charts are from December '02 to October '03. And I just want you to notice that the drought didn't change in those years either. And it actually got a little bit worse across the north central parts of the U.S. There's a lack of data, by the way, on the 2002-2003 charts because this was the time period that NOAA first created these drought monitors, and it was all experimental and had a limited amount of data in it. So the drought in 2002-03 was about as serious as the one that we've been dealing with here this year, and it's very important to keep in mind. The drought monitor up close for the prairies, I don't need to say too much. This is a long-term drought monitor, so it doesn't reflect the improvement that we got in October and November in parts of Manitoba in particular, but even in portions of eastern Saskatchewan. But this particular drought monitor has a very large bias towards the water supply, the general hydraulics. So it's picking up on the fact that even though we've had some moisture increases in the topsoil, we still have very low water supply because of the length of the drought that has prevailed across the region. So that's why we're still in the drought, even though we've had some relief. In the last growing season from April through October, this is the way we ranked. It really doesn't look all that terrible across the eastern parts of the prairies. Certainly the area around Regina certainly actually did fairly well because of a couple of rain events that took place. The only area that's really had a serious problem with record low precipitation was around the Saskatoon area. And but there, as well as I do, that their drought is still very serious in southern and east central Alberta, the western and central parts of Saskatchewan, and even out this way, we still have some real serious subsoil moisture issues. In the past 30 days, we have seen some improvement, and most definitely, without a question, we put some moisture on the ground and in some cases into the ground in parts of Manitoba and across northern and interior eastern parts of Saskatchewan. So very important this moisture was. We need to put a little bit of moisture into the ground so that if we've got some snow melt in the spring, we'll be able to put some seed in the ground and there'll be a little bit of moisture down below the surface that might be able to actually utilize the moisture. So there would be a better chance for crops to survive if we don't do real well with spring precipitation. So putting this moisture into the ground in those two bigger events that occurred in October and November was extremely important, and we will benefit from that. Unfortunately, a big part of Alberta and western and central parts of Saskatchewan were not a beneficiary of that event or those events, and they still are running pretty darn dry. Now, this is percentage of normal precipitation. You can see that southern and eastern parts of Manitoba actually were a little wetter biased in the 30 days ending December 3rd. Same thing from Regina southward towards the U.S. border. Not so is the case for a large part of eastern and southern Alberta and west central and central portions of Saskatchewan. Again, I'm probably not telling you anything you don't already know, but I'm trying to get us all onto the same page here as we start talking about where we're going from here. The moisture deficits that have occurred over these past 5 years from the drought across Canada are really staggering. Amazing how much moisture deficit we have accrued. But you know as well as I do, we don't need to fully restore our moisture profile to grow a crop. So these numbers are a little scary, but they're also very misleading because we only need some good topsoil moisture to get started and then hopefully regular occurring rainfall, and we can get along all right. Obviously, as we went through these past couple of years, we lost a lot of subsoil moisture, and so we are no longer capable of coming into the spring season in some parts of the prairies and being able to get a crop going without routinely occurring precipitation. So we're going to talk a little bit about what it's going to take to get that routinely occurring precipitation and whether or not there's any hope for that. I also wanted to point out that that we did get actually some above average precipitation to occur across a small part of the region in the last 60 days. And again, it's just reiterating what I've said before, so we'll move on. the soil moisture profile as of the 3rd of December, which is really kind of a snapshot as to where we were when we shut down the growing season. The frost is now getting into the ground in many areas, so it's going to be really difficult to change soil moisture between now and spring. But obviously, a big part of Saskatchewan and Alberta are still hurting badly for moisture, and we've got to do something to fix that. But in Manitoba, the situation is really not too bad. I mean, obviously, we need to get some regular occurring precipitation, and some areas are much drier than others. So we are a far cry from where we'd like to be, but it could be a whole lot worse here than it has become here recently. All right, there are several things that I want to point out that are going to control our weather over this next 9 months. One is the 18-year cycle. I talk about that every year. It's the primary pattern that controls our upper air wind flow pattern. So even though I talk about 18-year periods, that doesn't mean that the weather that you are experiencing at the surface is the same at every 18-year interval. That's not the case, but it does tell us that the upper wind flow pattern, there's some similarities. Now, these three charts are from 3 different 18-year cycle years. You should be able to notice some similarity right off the bat. The first similarity is the fact that there's ridginess in the western part of North America. That ridginess is basically dictates where our storm systems are going to come from during the course of the winter season. These are upper air wind flow charts. The winds blow from west to east along the lines. So as the lines, if they orientate from northwest to southeast, that means that basically our weather is going to come from the northwest. And so that is the case in all 3 of these charts, but more significantly in 1985, 86, and 2003-04. There's a little bit of difference in the 67-68 chart, and we see this periodically when we do long-range forecasting. One of the things that we look for is similarities in the 18-year cycle years. And when we have one year like this that doesn't match the other 2, obviously it's not as strong of a correlation as we would have if all 3 charts were the same. So, but there is similarities. If you'll notice, there's a convergence of the lines coming together in the middle of North America. That's on all 3 charts. That convergence is basically meaning that the air is being squeezed together at 18,000 feet. If you squeeze the air together, you cause the air to warm up and to dry out. It's just like if you used a bicycle pump and you were pumping air into a bicycle tire. As you take the large volume air and you squeeze it through a little nozzle that goes into your bicycle tire, you create a lot of heat. If you touch that valve after you've been pumping a bunch, you're going to get burned. It's going to be very hot, that valve is, because you're causing the air to be compressed. And same thing aloft. When we take those lines on the chart you're looking at and they start converging together, that means you're bringing air together and you're squeezing it. So that causes the air to warm up. It also causes the air to dry out. So those areas where the lines come together are usually drier biased areas. Very important to note. Now, this is the winter season. That's a long ways from the spring, but that gives us a little bit of a starting point here. Now, let's real quickly take a look at the La Nina event that is playing out here. La Nina is going to have a big factor, maybe, more so on the United States than in Canada. But here's the deal. If La Nina sticks around for too long of a period of time in the spring, it will possibly create a stronger ridge of high pressure in the United States. And if that happens, it will probably amplify into Manitoba and Saskatchewan. So what happens to La Nina could have a big role to play on what happens to our weather this spring and summer. So that's the reason why we're going to take a look at La Nina. La Nina basically lives in the in the eastern equatorial Pacific the eastern equatorial Pacific Ocean, close to the equator, and that's what you're looking at here. You've got to be able to look real closely at the chart, and if you'll on the far right-hand side, you can see the South American continent and Mexico and Central America, and on the lower left-hand side, you can see Australia. We're interested in the ocean temperatures anomalies that are present from the international date line, which is that vertical line kind of midway in the slide over to the South American coast. And when that ocean body is colder than normal, it's a La Nina event, and that's what you're looking at there. The 2 charts on the right-hand side of this page, are just basically showing you a broader perspective of the cool water in the equatorial region. And also the bottom right chart there shows some orange and red colors and some blue colors. What that basically means is the ocean temperatures recently have been mixed. There's been some of that ocean water that's been warming. There's some of the ocean water that's been cooling. It's really important to be able to determine which way we're going, because that's how we predict what La Nina is going to do. That ocean water, if it turns warmer, La Nina is going to go away. If the water gets colder or stays cold, it's going to be an ongoing issue with La Nina. So it's important that we pay attention to that. This chart here is kind of a complicated chart, and it helps us determine whether or not La Nina is going to prevail or not. These are actually subsurface ocean temperature anomalies. So there's 5 charts there. At the top of each one of those boxes is the surface of the ocean. At the bottom of each individual box is 300 meters under the water. And the heavy black line is where the international date line would be. I've taken the continents off of here, but this is basically a cross-sectional snapshot of ocean temperature anomalies in the Pacific. The top chart is the oldest, and the most recent is in the lower right-hand corner. And what I want you to do is take a look at the dark circle that I've drawn in there, and just let your eye go from the top to the bottom and then over to the right. And you can see how the ocean temperatures have been changing. What you should notice is that the ocean temperatures in the western part of that circled area have actually been moderating. Instead of being very cold as they are on the top chart, they have become more normalish as time has gone on. And what's important about this is that if that water is moderating, then the implication here is that La Nina is going to weaken as time moves along. And that's indeed what the forecast has been suggesting from NOAA and from other forecasting institutes that suggest that La Nina is going to peak out later this month and in January and then gradually weaken. What's really interesting about this situation, though, is that this forecast chart that you're looking at, it has been mellowing out. In other words, the sea surface temperatures were predicted to warm up rather quickly as we moved into January through March. And by April, back in a few weeks ago, by April, the forecast was suggesting that La Nina was going to be gone. This chart says, it's going to be a lot slower moderating, and that we may still have La Nina all the way out into June. And there's a lot of good reason why we would expect that to be the case. Even though you just saw the ocean temperatures warming up out there, I think there's a lot of support for the La Nina to linger longer in the spring. Now, why do we care about La Nina? In the winter months, it gives us a northwest flow across Canada. So if we have a northwest flow, if you recall, the first set of charts I showed you were the 18-year cycle years, and what were they showing? They were showing a northwest flow too. Northwest flows during the winter season in Canada usually gives us less than usual precipitation, except along the front range of the Rocky Mountains in Alberta, and sometimes across the southernmost part of the prairies, from southwestern Saskatchewan and southernmost Alberta into sometimes southwestern Manitoba. Most of the time it's down into the Dakotas and Minnesota. But we usually have a cold bias during the winter season with a La Nina event. All right, we're going to stop right there, and this is the official winter forecast that you're looking at. I know you're not so much caring about winter, but it does tell us a lot about what's going to happen in the spring because it determines how much moisture we're going to possibly have. So in the month of December, we're going to continue a below average precipitation bias in the heart of the prairies, including most of Saskatchewan and east central parts of Alberta. There will be more of a normalish precipitation distribution across Manitoba, but remember, it'll be cool, and we probably aren't going to put much moisture in the ground, but we will probably put a little bit of snow on top of the ground, and that's going to help us maybe a little bit later down the road. All right, the November through March period, that's basically the winter season. Again, the focus is the below average precipitation in Saskatchewan. There's also a little tendency for less than normal precipitation in western Manitoba. But the southeast corner of Manitoba, from the Winnipeg area southward to the U.S. border, was probably going to have a normal to slightly above average precipitation potential. So there'll be a little more snow on the ground in those areas. Notice there'll be above average precipitation out there along the Front Range in Alberta, across the area south of Highway 1 in Alberta, and into the southwestern corner of Saskatchewan. Temperatures will be colder biased. I don't think we're going to be as cold across the prairies as it will be down in the States as we get into January and February. Our weather will be more seasonably cool. Their weather will be more notably colder than normal. All right, let's turn our attention now to a couple of other patterns that are going to be influencing our weather as we go forward into the spring and summer of 2022. The first thing is the solar cycle. The solar cycle is very key right now. This drought that's prevailing in North America is tightly associated with the 22-year solar cycle. And the merging of the 22-year solar cycle with La Nina dictates a lot of weather that's going to be dry biased for the U.S. And that's why La Nina is so important and why this solar cycle is so important. The solar cycle is nothing more than sunspot numbers, okay? When you take a look at the sun through a telescope and filter it out, you'll see dark blotches above the surface of the sun. Those are sunspots, and those vary from a minimum number to a maximum number as we go forward over a 10 to 12 year period. And we call that the 11-year cycle. Now, you'll notice on this chart that you're looking at that each one of the 11-year cycles that are plotted there, sometimes there's a lot more sunspots and other times there's fewer of them. What that basically reflects is how warm the sun is. We've learned that the more sunspots are present in a 10 to 12 year cycle, the hotter the sun is. So the sun was heating up largely from the early 1900s to about early 80s, and then it started kind of bouncing around a little bit. We really have a trend right now where the sunspot numbers have been declining. So the sun is actually putting out a little less heat now than it was back in the early 1900s. I know that doesn't. Why are we heating up, right? There's a very complicated scenario here, but basically we do live in a greenhouse, and the amount of heat that is absorbed from the sun is often trapped in our atmosphere, and that's why all the pollutants that are in our air, it does create a lag in the cooling that's occurring in the earth. But anyway, I'm kind of digressing a little bit. There's the 11-year cycle, which is those narrow ones, and then a 22-year cycle where there's two of the 11-year cycles together. The reason why there's a 22-year cycle is because there is a change in polarity for the sun every 22 years. That means their North Pole becomes their South Pole, and the South Pole becomes the North Pole. I know this is all very abstract. You're probably going to sleep on me, but here's the deal. When we make comparisons of one part of the solar cycle and try to relate it to weather, we need to make sure that we're comparing apples to apples. So if we take an 11-year cycle and compare it to another 11-year cycle, the polarity of the sun's different, and so we're not really looking at apples to apples. So we want to look at 22-year period because we know the sun is in the same mode now that it was 22 years ago. And there's actually a very strong correlation between the two that influence all kinds of things, but what we're interested today in is La Nina. And La Nina tends to occur more often between the solar minimum and the solar maximum during any 11-year cycle. But we're also interested in the 22-year cycle. And what we have found is that the longest lasting La Nina events occur in the 22-year cycle. And so usually they evolve right after the solar minimum and they last for a few years. And that's exactly what's occurring right now. This La Nina is already 17 months old. And if we go back and look at the other sunspot year or 22-year solar cycle years, you will notice the La Nina can last from 23 to 36 months. And so that means this La Nina, even though we're showing signs of warming in the ocean, there is potential this La Nina will last into the spring and maybe summer next year. So we're going to be watching for that. These two charts you're looking at here show a relationship with the La Nina events that occur after the solar minimum in a 22-year solar cycle, the top two charts on the United States. And it shows that there's a very definite below average precipitation bias in parts of the Midwest and the southeastern states of the U.S., and a tendency for cooler than usual temperatures in the north and eastern parts of that country. The bottom two charts show the same years, will show the 18-year cycle years that are playing out for 2022. And notice that there's the same below average bias in parts of the western Corn Belt and U.S. plains, and a more significant dry bias in the southeastern United States. And also temperatures during the winter are going to be colder biased if you buy into the 18-year cycle. This is all important. I know we're looking at the U.S., but it's going to have an influence on us across the prairies too. All of this is going to be connected. Just as an FYI, the U.S. is very definitely dry, just like the drought monitor suggested. Most of hard red winter wheat country needs a good drink of water. They're not going to get it. The wheat crop in Montana was not well established. It's struggling, and it's dormant now, so it's not going to make any difference for the next few weeks. And we also have problems in the Pacific Northwest of the U.S. as drought continues to be an issue there. So for the next few months across the U.S., what we're basically looking at is an ongoing persistence of below normal precipitation in the central parts of the U.S. That's coming from the 18-year cycle and coming from La Nina. Both support a below average precipitation bias. Now remember, we have a drought in most of the western part of North America right now. And what will happen over the winter, as you can see, the precipitation bias here is a little bit greater for California and the Pacific Northwest. We're going to kind of whittle away the western edge of the drought over the next few months, and we're going to build up the drought in parts of the U.S. plains and the western Corn Belt. Now, that's important for us because as we get into the summer season, if we get into the late spring and we still have this dry bias to our south, and we start building up the annual ridge of high pressure in the middle of the U.S., that ridge could become extra strong and will build northward and can go back across Manitoba and southeastern Saskatchewan. So if we get a little break in the spring, we could go back into dryness later in the summer. And that's what we're going to kind of talk about here as we discuss more about these charts. Now, unfortunately, Environment Canada does not have the database that they have in the U.S., so these charts I'm going to show you right now have to do with these 22-year solar cycle years when La Nina has persisted. And what I want you to do is just look from the top to the bottom of these series of years. These are all years in which are occurring between the solar minimum and the solar maximum. And I want you to take note of the dryness that tends to occur quite often. There's usually a multi-year drought that occurs in a part of the U.S. Now, this is really important because some of the years that are included in this 22-year cycle include the 1950s and the 1930s. Now, you probably know enough about weather to know that in the 1930s, we had a pretty serious drought in North America. In fact, probably the worst one that's occurred in modern history. In the 1950s, there was also a serious drought in the United States. But that drought was different from the 30s because while it was droughty in the U.S. in the 1950s, Canada's prairies were doing very well with rain. In fact, it was maybe even a little bit too wet in parts of the prairies during that particular period. The reason for the difference has to do with the orientation of the ridge of high pressure over North America and how much of Canada gets included in that ridge and how much is not. So if the ridge is just a weak ridge that comes up into southern Manitoba, you're going to bring storms in from the U.S. Pacific Northwest and through Alberta and into the heart of Saskatchewan and make it rain. But if you have a really strong ridge that goes from Texas all the way up into the heart of Manitoba and eastern Saskatchewan, there's not going to be any rain in the eastern prairies, and it's going to rain out to the west. So this is really important, and as we go through and assess the spring and summer, that's what we're after here. These are spring 18-year cycle charts. The very first thing you should notice is that we still have a northwesterly flow pattern aloft on these charts. So in other words, we are going to continue to have that cool northwest flow at least in the first half of our spring season, March and April in particular. If we keep a northwest flow pattern going in the spring, what will happen is we'll be a little slow warming up, and more importantly, we're going to keep the precipitation a little subdued. So we aren't necessarily going to see large volumes of precipitation when we get into the spring season. And farther to the south in the U.S., just from the 18-year cycle here, you're seeing a drier tendency because, again, we're squeezing the air together in the mid levels of the atmosphere and drying out parts of the western Corn Belt and also the plains. These charts are the 18-year cycle rainfall patterns that occurred in the prairies during the spring months, March, April, and May. And what I've done in this chart is I've tried to locate similarities. So you might see On the left-hand column there for the 18-year March images, you're seeing a tendency for wet bias conditions in the northern parts of the prairies, at least in 2 of the 3 years in March. In April, there's a tendency for less precipitation to show up in parts of the central sections of the prairies, including Saskatchewan. Very important chart to note that month of April and the drier tendency in the middle. But notice Manitoba in April has a tendency here to be wet biased. Even in March, there's even a very limited amount of dry biased conditions for Manitoba. And when you get into May, there's still a lack of dry weather for Manitoba. So this chart is basically showing us that the potential for us to get relief in the spring across our region is relatively good, just based on the 18-year cycle. And again, we haven't addressed La Nina, and we haven't really addressed the solar cycle too much, and a couple of other things that we need to throw in there. But just looking at this chart, yeah, it's a little dry in Saskatchewan in April, but it's not in May, and it's really not that much in March. So what we actually get a chance here to do is we have a chance to get some crops in the ground, and then it starts to rain. And so the potential here for seeing a fairly decent spring is really not too bad. What about the summer? The 18-year cycle pattern shows a ridge of high pressure across parts of North America in all 3 of these images. All 3 years, 1968, 1986, and 2004. Now, it looks like if we're going to have a ridge, the very first thing you might be thinking is, a ridge of high pressure, that's bad. That means we're going to be hot and dry. But the reality is that this ridge that you're looking at here is actually a weak ridge. And when we stop and we look at the pattern on a day-by-day basis, I get so bored sometimes, that's what I do. I loop from one day to the next and look at all 3 of these years on a daily basis. What I saw was that there was a frequent succession of weather systems moving from west to east across the prairies in all 3 of these years. So even though we've got a mean ridge there, it's a weak ridge, and we actually get a good mix of rain and sunshine. If it was totally up to the 18-year cycle, we would have a fantastic growing year in 2022. But we do have the drought that's already present in North America, and we already know that La Nina has a chance to last longer than usual. That means that Texas through South Dakota and into Iowa and Missouri could have a real serious dry bias in the spring. So when the ridge starts to build up, there's going to be a lot of heat there and a lot of dryness across the western and central parts of the U.S. That's fuel for the ridge to become stronger. And so we want to make sure we properly assess the mix there. The charts you're looking at here, the top 2 are the upper air wind flow patterns from the 22-year solar cycle that was appropriate for last summer. So July through August, the upper air wind flow pattern in the upper left-hand corner there shows what it was like in 1955, 1974, and 1999, which are the 22-year solar cycle equivalencies to last year. Now, those aren't, and what I want you to notice is the similarities in the upper air wind flow pattern. They both charts show a weak ridge of high pressure. We know that that ridge was a lot stronger than what it looks like out there because we had a lot of heat and dryness that occurred across a big part of the prairies and the northern U.S. plains. But the point is that we can look at the 22-year cycle and get a pretty good hint at what we're going to see in 2020. In the next year. So we can see the 2021 was similar to these other 3 years. So the lower left-hand chart here shows the 22-year cycle charts that would be equivalent for the 2022 growing season. Notice that there's still the same ridge in the same place. And this ridge is also located in the same area that the 18-year cycle charts were showing. So now we have a pretty strong agreement between the solar cycle and the 18-year cycle that there's going to be this ridge present. So now what it comes down to is deciding exactly what position will the ridge take and how intense will it be. The stronger the ridge, the less rain will occur in the prairies. And this is for the heart of the summer now. Another similar chart that I wanted to show is from those same 3 22-year cycle years. This is what occurred in the U.S. The top chart there shows the precipitation bias for June through August, and notice it was below average precipitation in much of the plains, down into a part of the lower Mississippi Basin and the southeastern United States. But notice on the Canada border, there's some near to above average precipitation that showed up. This is an average of those 3 years. So in all 3 years, we did get precipitation to show up across some of these areas. All right, the temperatures, I don't think we need to pay a whole lot of attention to. I don't buy it very much. I think there is a chance for some cooler tendencies in the western part of North America and warmth in the middle of the country, but let's not dwell on that. It's really about precipitation. Here is the summer charts from the 18-year cycle for the prairies. And June is on the left, July in the middle, and August is on the right. And you should have noticed a couple of things. Number one, there's no more than 1 month of anomalously dry weather in the prairies through the summer. So if you find an area of dry bias, the next month is usually better. And that's the case across most of the production region. The other thing I want you to notice is some of these charts that are in the middle there in July. You'll notice that there's the red box that's kind of orientated a little bit southwest to northeast. That is going to come up the backside of the ridge of high pressure. It's going to bring storm systems out of Montana and across Saskatchewan. I feel pretty comfortable with this. As long as the ridge of high pressure doesn't get crazy strong, we will still see rain come up to bring relief to Alberta and Saskatchewan. In the meantime, Manitoba is probably the big question mark because we feel strongly that spring is going to be good in Manitoba. What we don't know is where that ridge is going to be and how strong it'll be. When we get to August, we could end up having a ridge that comes up from the States and could stymie some of our rainfall potential. So that's the biggest threat that we have. My official forecast as of this moment in time, it basically suggests that Manitoba will be wet biased in the spring. Our areas off to the west will be seeing near to slightly below normal precipitation. I may be a little too generous with the rainfall. It would not surprise me to come into spring and still have some chronic dryness issues in Saskatchewan and Alberta and a lot of nail biting as far as the producers out there are worried that they're not going to get the rain. Because we're going to have that northwest flow that's going to last in March and into early April, and that's going to limit the amount of precipitation that occurs, may keep us a little cool. So it'll be late April and May before we start seeing the relief, but I think we will get it. The chart on the right is for June through August. Notice I've given Manitoba a little bit less precipitation, a little bit of a below average bias because I am concerned about the ridge and what it might do. But I do go ahead and bring in greater amounts of precipitation in the central and western parts of the production region. Now, a lot of caution is needed. So when you get down the road into February and March, and you start looking at some of these upper air charts that are online or whatever, you need to be watching to see whether that dryness in the U.S. is still in place and whether there's chatter about a strong ridge coming up in March or April in the middle of the U.S. The last factor that's going to have a big influence on North America is called Pacific Decadal Oscillation. And it has to do with how much cold water is off the west coast of North America. The colder the water is relative to normal off that west coast will result in a trough of low pressure coming into California, Washington, Oregon, Nevada. As that trough develops, if this PDO is significantly negative, that means that the ocean temperatures are notably cold biased. And if they're cold biased, this trough of low pressure will evolve and it will cause a downstream ridge of high pressure to build up across the central United States. I'm going to skip this chart and come up to the chart that illustrates this best for you. On the left-hand side is the PDO upper air wind flow pattern for both the positive phase and the negative phase. So if it's a positive phase, that means the ocean temperatures are warmer than normal off the west coast of North America. If it's the negative phase, the temperatures are cooler than usual. So if they're cooler than usual, as they are today, and rather significantly cooler than usual in some spots, we'll get this late spring and summer pattern where a trough of low pressure comes into the western United States, a ridge in the middle of the country, and then a trough in the eastern part of the country. The red color here is below average precipitation. The blues would be above. What I want you to notice is in the Pacific Northwest. If we get storm systems that come into the Washington, Oregon, Idaho areas, and the ridge position is exactly where I've got it here, those storms will ride up the backside of that ridge and spread that rain across Saskatchewan and Alberta. Now, if the ridge is slightly farther to the east, let's say it's over maybe the Missouri River Valley, running from Kansas and Missouri up into eastern parts of the Dakotas into Manitoba, then the rains might advance a little farther to the east, but there would be a potential for more dryness to occur in the southeast corner of the prairies. If the ridge is low amplitude, those storms won't go up there to the northeast. They'll actually go more east-northeasterly and go right over the top of the ridge, and everybody in the prairies will get rain like the 18-year cycle was suggesting. So it's all about this ridge, and it's all about the phase of PDO and whether or not La Nina sticks around. So if Pacific Decadal Oscillation is as strongly negative in the spring and summer next year as it is today, then I think we'll have a strong ridge, and I think Manitoba will have a wet spring and then a drier summer. And same thing for eastern Saskatchewan or southeastern Saskatchewan. If the PDO is not significantly negative and La Nina is gone or very weak or minimal, then I think we could have some well-distributed rains across the majority of the prairies during our growing season. Either way, we're going to do better in 2022 than we did this year. And I think that's true for Manitoba as well as Alberta and Saskatchewan. And I do feel fairly strongly about that. It's just the details that I can't sort out because we're so far away from the growing season. I don't know where we're going to be with this PDO and La Nina. For the U.S. to the south, that's where the dryness is going to be most significant. If PDO is still negative and La Nina is still around in spring and early summer, most likely we will end up with a tendency here for the U.S. Plains and Western Corn Belt to have a dry bias, and it could be droughty down there in a little bit more significant manner. That would be great for market prices, not so great for their production down that way. The bottom line is I think Canada will see improvement. I think the U.S. will see a deterioration in some of its western crop areas. And I'm a little concerned about the U.S. dryness in the southeast corner of the country too, because that's supposed to evolve over the winter and into early spring. And if we move the ridge far enough to the east so it's over the western corn belt, the two areas of dryness could actually merge together, and we could have a more broad-based area of dryness in the states. So a lot to be watching for and looking at as we go forward to the next few months. Real quickly, I don't want to take up all the time for questions and answers and all that, but I do want to talk real briefly about some of the other places in the world and what will happen to their crops. You're looking at South America. The Brazilian charts on the left here are percent of normal precipitation. The upper left-hand corner is this month, November, and the lower left is from October. And you'll notice that there's this drying tendency occurring in southern Brazil. This is classic La Nina. When La Nina events occur, southern Brazil's rainfall goes below normal. And we expect this pattern to prevail through December and maybe into January. Now, the soil moisture charts on the right-hand side, notice the topsoil is already a little dry in parts of western Paraná and a few spots in Rio Grande do Sul. This isn't critically dry, but it's not going to rain the rest of this week. We'll get a little bit of shower activity maybe over the weekend and then go back into some more drying next week. So southern Brazil is expected to dry down, and so will be the case in neighboring areas of southeastern Paraguay, Uruguay, and extreme eastern Argentina. Now, will it be enough to move the market in a major way? That's a big question that needs to be debated. I can't really tell you that it's going to be a real serious bout of dryness. One of the things that's happened here recently is that the temperatures have been normal. There's been no excessive heat in South America. So when it hasn't been raining, the moisture hasn't been evaporated as aggressively as it could. So it hasn't become excessively dry yet. The chart you're looking at here is from Argentina. Top chart again on the left-hand side is November's precipitation. Notice how abundantly moist it's been in Argentina this month. There's a false belief out there that La Nina events always create droughts in Argentina, and that is false. The truth of what La Nina does for Argentina is it makes below average precipitation in eastern parts of the country during the summer. A lot of times the spring is dry, but the summer is usually fairly good in the west and dry in the east. The bottom chart is from October. You can see it was dry originally, but it has certainly got a lot better here recently. And the soil moisture profile is not ideal in Argentina, but it's not bad either. The forecast over these next few weeks is basically going to be perpetuating these trends. So I think we're going to see below average precipitation in southern Brazil, eastern Argentina, Uruguay, and southern Paraguay. So there will be a little bit of a yield cut in those areas, but the rest of Brazil should do very well. and that includes the bigger soybean producing states of Mato Grosso, Goiás, and Mato Grosso do Sul, maybe even parts of Sao Paulo. So there's going to be a lot of production, good yields in many areas, but the south part of Brazil may come up a little short. And Argentina will probably see a generally good summer for them. There may be a little loss on yield in the extreme east, but the bulk of the most important production areas are actually farther to the west, which should still get some timely precipitation. All right, in Australia, we've just gone through a period of wet biased weather. And what I just wanted to show with this particular chart you're looking at is that every La Nina event that has occurred in the same 22-year cycle has always turned Australia wet at some point between October and December of each of those years. And let's take a look at where we were in October, which is the lower right-hand corner. It was pretty dry across a big part of Australia at that point in time. They were having a tremendous growing season. They had a lot of high-yielding wheat, barley, and canola. Everything looked fantastic. But the upper right-hand chart reflects what happened in the last few weeks, and notice how much rain fell. A lot of the wheat, barley, and canola that hadn't been harvested yet in some of that country certainly had suffered a decline in quality. Most of the production is still high, but the quality was reduced in some areas. New South Wales was most impacted, but I don't think that we're going to encounter any huge drops in production because the rest of the country has done relatively well. Now, as far as the future is concerned, Australia still has more rain coming, but it's going to be a factor for cotton and sorghum more than for wheat, barley, or canola. They will have some temporary periods of improvement coming up, so the harvest should advance relatively well. I think that the worst of Australia's harvest weather is behind them for now, but later this month they'll run into it again, and this time it'll be maybe impacting the areas along the southeast coast down in Victoria and maybe a few southern New South Wales locations. Outside of that, just another little heads up for later in the year. All that I've told you about Canada and the U.S. weather in the summer coming up is going to be dittoed, in other words, copied or very similar to what's going to occur in parts of Russia, in Russia's new lands. That's where they grow their spring wheat and their sunseed. And there's potential that there will be a dry bias in those areas as well. And that's based on the same factors, the solar cycle and La Nina, as well as the 18-year cycle. So keep an eye on Russia's new lands. That's very important. And also, I think that there's a slight chance, these charts are kind of reflecting a little dry bias in northeastern China. I'm not ready to buy into that one quite yet, but the charts are a little disturbing. And so if we get dryness in Russia and get dryness in parts of China, and still have dryness in the U.S., it could get very interesting again in the growing season next year. But the bottom line is that Canada is positioned to benefit from all of this, I believe. So we'll be watching real closely to see where we're going to end up down the road. I'll just skip through these charts and just open up the floor to questions that turn it back over to our moderator, and we'll go forward from there.
All right. Thanks, Drew. This has been a great meeting so far. My name is Ben Kuzy, and I'm going to talk just a few moments about the grain markets. Again, this has been really enlightening so far. So thanks, Brian, Matthew. And after Drew's message, this is going to feel a little bit like going from college back to kindergarten because or preschool, because I really only have one slide, and the one slide that I have has a visual with some cartoons and pictures on it. So I'm pretty, I've got some young kids at home and pretty into the picture books to tell a story recently. So I want to talk again about the grain markets and specifically prices, and just rewind the tape for a couple of minutes and think about the last 2.5 years and really what we've seen in the markets as it pertains to the canola and wheat markets. So again, when we think back 2.5 years ago, we were coming off of geopolitical issues, a trade war. We went right from a trade war into a global pandemic. We saw, supply chain disruptions, bare shelves at the grocery store, as Drew talked about, some increased weather volatility. increased participation in the funds, and it's really led to an unprecedented bull market. And we fast forward into today and look at the current situation. We heard from Matthew and the sky high inputs costs, potential for huge acre shifts next year, inflationary concerns. You've got predicted increase for the need for oil seeds and soybeans and canola crush markets. So it's really leading to this question: what are we going to see in the future? Right? More of the same. Is this bull market going to continue, or are we going to see a little bit of a return to the norm or regression to the norm? And the reason for the chart on the screen is just to ask everyone on the phone just to kind of reflect and think about where you are at: hope, invincible, fear, panic, and think about your current emotions and some of the emotions that you've felt over the last 2.5 years, particularly as it pertains to the markets and the crops that you either have in the bin today, maybe on storage, or are thinking about selling already for next year. And think about where your emotions are today. I noticed in the chat, and I was kind of chuckling to myself. Someone asked Matthew a question, or when are we going to see more normal urea prices? But I didn't see a question of anyone asking when are we going to see more normal canola or wheat prices, because just as urea has continued to increase, obviously we've seen an unprecedented bull market in unprecedented prices in both wheat and canola as well. So there's an old saying: the cure for high prices is high prices. Not saying that the current market can't continue to go higher, but really the point of the slide today is just to think about where your emotions are and how they play a part in your grain marketing decisions. Whether you are feeling hopeful right now, whether you're feeling invincible and you've got your superhero cape on, the message that I want to bring to you today is that when you work with Cargill and you work with the folks that come out to your farm at Cargill, we come to your farm with a portfolio of risk management tools and solutions for whatever emotion you are experiencing. So if you are feeling fearful, for example, we've got a litany of different tools that will help you lock in a concrete floor on your wheat or canola sales. If you're feeling hopeful and you think there's upside in the market, we've got also ways that we can help you express and lock in certain levels, but give yourself unlimited upside participation in the market. So again, the message today as it pertains to the grain marketing piece is, I don't know where, and many of the folks would agree that no one knows where grain markets are going to go, where the oilseed markets are going to go here in the next 2 years. We could continue to see the unprecedented bull market that we've experienced the last 2 years, or we could see a little bit of the regression to the norm. But the message today is, when you work with Cargill and you work with the tools, solutions, and most important, the people in a diversified plan, you're going to set yourself up in your farm for success moving forward with this tool and with these people. So that's the message today. Short and sweet. And again, thank you for having me.
Thanks, Ben. Pictures are worth 1,000 words sometimes, so I could clearly understand what you're presenting. Would want to say thank you to Matthew and Drew as well. I mean, obviously, lots of questions on the chat about fertilizer. Matthew, thank you for looking at and answering some of those questions. Drew, today I learned something about Pacific decadal oscillation. I didn't know what that means. I'm not sure I still do, but I know it's going to have an impact on what potentially could happen in Manitoba for the spring. So thanks for that, Drew. There was a question that came up on the chat around in regards to the 18-year cycle that you discussed. In 2004, we had a very cool summer and then a bad frost late August. And obviously, the $1 million question is, will this repeat? So I know you were talking about some of those things. So that was a question that was in the chat for you.
Yeah, the 2004 event was quite a fluke, to say the least. Um, but we did see it coming back in that particular period. I don't think that we can get that kind of pattern to repeat depending on, again, where we're going to be with rigidness in our summer coming up. Most likely, I think that our pattern is going to be a little bit more active, and so we'll have frequent disturbances coming from southwest to northeast through at least a part of the prairies, and that will disrupt the northwest flow that's required for that 2004 event to be repeating. Now, it's always dangerous. I mean, I don't know what I'm doing most of the time anyway, and we are trying to predict something that's going to occur about 10 to 11 months from now. So, it's a dangerous thing to try to do. What I suggest, and I put a written response out there too. I think we usually, for me, to make a judgment call on the frost freeze thing, I need to be in at least June. Because in June I can see where we are with the ridge. I can also look out another month or two and see whether or not there's any reason to believe that there would be a cold surge coming up. So if I had to throw money on the table and say that, I'll place this bet here, I would say that no, we won't see 2004 repeated. I think that we'll have too much moisture in the western part of the prairies around to keep the humidity up. And I do think that this ridge of high pressure that we may have during midsummer could be significant enough to thwart that as a potential. But don't hold me to that. Best thing you can do is to stay in touch, and we'll take another look at it when we get closer to that time period.
Thanks, Drew. In terms of the fertilizer questions, Matthew, I don't know. I know you've been typing feverishly in there to the response. Are there any of those particular questions you wanted to reach back out to the broader group on? Thank you for responding, just to cover them verbally here.
No, I think there's some good questions in there. You talked about the countervailing duties on Moroccan and Russian phosphate into the U.S. and its effect on Canada. All our phosphate is now sourced from the U.S., so anything that affects their pricing will affect our pricing. At some point, we've started to see Moroccan product find its way through and around the U.S. To avoid duties and it get into Western Canada. That may help in the future, but just with tight supply right now, it's not offering any price relief. Um, Another question came up in regards to, supply this spring. And as of today, the plan is to have, everything covered and in place for the spring. But there's a lot that can happen between, or a lot that has to happen and can happen between now and the spring in regards to logistics and supply chain. And so, the sooner we can, continue to move tons to farm ahead of the spring and get our bins all charged, the less hiccups we'll have in spring. But right now, we're significantly behind on movement compared to where we would be normally. So I just ask that keep pulling tons as they are made available, and we're gonna have a real busy few months of winter shipping.
Thanks, Matthew. And I would just comment from the Manitoba region as well, as we look to fertilizer availability. Obviously, it's a fairly dynamic market, but at the end of the day, I know the team's working very closely on what we've been able to secure and buy from manufacturers, is how we're positioning to farmers. And the comment was around, if we've made a commitment to you, will there be product there? And the plan is absolutely to say that's our goal going into here, as we get commitments and contracts with manufacturers on supply, and that's the position that we were talking to farmers about and signing contracts around. So that's what we'll continue to do here through the balance of the year and into spring. Another question came up for Drew, and I'm not sure, Drew, if you do you have any comments on the article in the Western Producer on cloud seeding technology? So I don't know if you're familiar with that article. I'm not personally, but if you were, then make a comment. If not, we can get back to it.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with the article. I know there's been a lot of debate about the success or problems that are created from the cloud seeding projects that have gone on. So a lot of debate about that, and there's always been a lot of debate as to whether or not we are really being successful in changing the weather. The question is are we doing a good job in reducing the amount of the number of storms that are capable of producing hail. And there's some that believe that all that's been resulting from this is that the hail has been pushed further away from the areas where they were trying to stop it from. So there's all kinds of debate out there. But again, I can't comment because I didn't see the article. But cloud seeding does work to a certain degree, but it does depend on certain circumstances. And there's some countries out there like China that just swear that they can change the weather in any way, shape, or form. And I've seen their claims that they've made this, that, or the other happen, and I totally disagree with them. And I don't know about Canada work or the northern U.S. plains work. I don't think that anyone's out there beating their chest saying that they can do whatever. But it's an interesting thing to try to do. There's some validity to it, but I think we have to be really careful how we assess it. It's just like when we start talking about some of the climate issues. We don't have a control Earth somewhere where we can take the same set of circumstances and do this to change the atmosphere or do that and go back and look at our control and see how that compares. We only have one planet and one atmosphere, and so it's really difficult to be able to say for sure what has caused this, that, or the other. So again, I apologize that I'm not familiar with the article that was out, but that's the overview of the whole subject matter.
Thanks, Drew. In terms of, I think there's a few more specific questions that we'll get back to folks directly on there, very specific. So I never got posted into the group chat. There's most of the other ones that were either answered directly on the chat or not. But I would to to wrap things up, I would just like to say thank you to Matthew, Drew, and Ben for joining us today, and thank you to all the customers that signed on. We'd certainly love to be doing these type of events in person, but everything that's going on, we continue to have to adapt and use technology, and these virtual events are a good second choice. And thank you for everyone for jumping in and logging on today. I would, as Ben was talking through about what to do with the grain marketing, I do want to echo his comments that we do have tools and solutions that are available to all those different circumstances, and please reach out to your local facilities, your grain crop input sales representatives, and/or your grain advisors to continue to work through these interesting situations and come up with the best plan and strategy that's for you and your farm. So that's certainly where we'd like to go. And if there's, like you say, any other the questions that come through the chat, we will make sure that each one of them gets responded to and in a timely manner. And with that, I would just say thank you to everyone and have a great rest of your week and take care.